I stand witness this morning to what future historians will recognize as the most significant monetary transformation since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. As I analyze the accelerating construction of parallel financial architectures by emerging powers, I observe not merely economic competition but the systematic dismantling of American financial hegemony. The dollar-based global order that has governed international commerce for 8 decades now faces coordinated challenges from multiple directions simultaneously. The BRICS nations have evolved from a convenient acronym coined by a Goldman Sachs analyst into an institutional framework for monetary rebellion. What began as informal coordination among Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa has transformed into a deliberate strategy to end dollar dominance. I track these developments with growing awareness that we are witnessing the early stages of a historic transition. To understand where we are heading, I must first examine how we arrived at this extraordinary moment. The dollar's global supremacy originated at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, during July 1944. As World War II still raged, representatives from 44 nations gathered to design the post-war monetary order. The United States, possessing over 2/3 of global gold reserves and the only major economy undamaged by war, dictated terms. The Bretton Woods Agreement established the dollar as the anchor of international finance. Other currencies would maintain fixed exchange rates against the dollar, while the dollar itself remained convertible. 2 gold at $35 per ounce. This arrangement gave America extraordinary privileges. The United States could print the currency that other nations needed for international trade and reserve holdings. I analyze this system as fundamentally asymmetric from its inception. European and Asian nations had to earn dollars through exports or attract American investment. The United States simply printed dollars that the world was obligated to accept. This exorbitant privilege, as French finance minister Giscard d'Estaing famously termed it, enabled American consumption beyond its productive capacity. The system contained inherent contradictions that Belgian economist Robert Triffin identified as early as 1960. To supply global liquidity, America had to run persistent balance of payments deficits, but those same deficits would eventually undermine confidence in the dollar's gold convertibility. I observe this Triffin dilemma as the original sin of dollar hegemony that continues generating instability today. By the late 1960s, the system approached breaking point. France under Charles de Gaulle openly challenged American monetary privilege. French officials exchanged dollar holdings for physical gold, demanding delivery from American vaults. Other nations followed this example as confidence in dollar convertibility eroded. The London Gold Pool, established to maintain the official gold price, collapsed in 1968 under selling pressure. President Richard Nixon confronted an impossible choice in August 1971. America's gold reserves had declined from over 20,000 tons in 1944 to barely 8,000 tons, foreign dollar holdings far exceeded remaining gold backing. On August 15, 1971, Nixon closed the gold window, ending dollar convertibility and effectively destroying the Bretton Woods system. I analyze the Nixon Shock as a moment when American default was rebranded as monetary innovation. The United States essentially told the world that dollars would no longer be redeemable for gold, yet demanded continued acceptance of dollars in international commerce. Remarkably, this audacious move succeeded. The dollar remained dominant. Despite losing its metallic foundation, the genius of American monetary strategists lay in finding a new anchor for dollar demand. The petrodollar system, constructed through Henry Kissinger's diplomacy with Saudi Arabia between 1973 and 1975, replaced gold with oil. Saudi Arabia agreed to price all oil exports in dollars and invest surplus revenues in American Treasury securities. In exchange, America guaranteed Saudi security against regional threats. This arrangement created artificial dollar demand on a massive scale. Every nation that imported oil needed dollars to pay for it. Oil exporters accumulated dollar reserves that required recycling into dollar-denominated assets. I observe this system as essentially forcing the world to finance American consumption and military expenditure through their energy purchases. For 5 decades, the petrodollar system sustained American financial supremacy. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves peaked above 70%. International trade invoicing remained overwhelmingly dollar-denominated. The Federal Reserve became the de facto central bank of the world, with its policy decisions reverberating through every economy on Earth. But I now observe this architecture fracturing under pressures that previous generations could not have anticipated. The weaponization of dollar dominance against Russia following the 2022 Ukraine invasion crystallized dangers that other nations had long perceived abstractly. Freezing $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves demonstrated that dollar holdings were not truly owned by their holders but existed at American sufferance. This revelation accelerated de-dollarization efforts that had previously proceeded gradually. I analyze the psychological impact as perhaps more significant than the immediate economic consequences. Central bankers worldwide recognized that decades of accumulated reserves could vanish overnight if their governments pursued policies Washington disapproved of. The fundamental bargain underlying dollar hegemony had been exposed as conditional. China's response has been methodical and comprehensive. The cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, now processes over $14 trillion in annual transactions. This infrastructure enables yuan-denominated international payments without touching American-controlled systems. I observe CIPS expanding rapidly, with over 1,400 participating institutions across more than 100 countries. Russia developed its own alternative following earlier sanctions imposed after Crimea's annexation. In 2014, the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, or SPFS, initially served domestic purposes but has progressively integrated with partner nations. I analyze the integration of CIPS and SPFS as creating the backbone of a parallel financial infrastructure explicitly designed to operate beyond Western control. India contributes the Unified Payments Interface, which has revolutionized domestic digital payments and now extends internationally. Singapore, Wei, and other nations have linked their payment systems to UPI. I observe this technological infrastructure enabling transaction flows that bypass dollar-denominated correspondent banking entirely. Bilateral currency swap agreements have proliferated with remarkable speed. China maintains swap lines exceeding $500 billion with over 40 countries, enabling direct currency exchange without dollar intermediation. I analyze these agreements as building blocks for a new monetary architecture where the dollar plays a diminished role. Russia and China now conduct over 90% of bilateral trade in their own currencies. The accumulation of gold by central banks signals profound distrust in the dollar-based system. I observe China adding over 300 tons to official reserves in recent years, though actual acquisitions likely far exceed reported figures. Russia transformed its reserve composition, reducing dollar holdings from over 40% to negligible levels while accumulating gold that now constitutes a substantial portion of national reserves. The repatriation of gold from Western vaults carries symbolic and practical significance. Germany completed the return of 674 tons from New York and Paris, a process that required years and generated substantial controversy. Turkey repatriated its gold from American depositories. Poland brought home 100 tons from the Bank of England. I analyze these movements as nations seeking physical control over assets that paper claims on foreign vaults cannot guarantee. Historical precedent haunts these developments. When France under de Gaulle demanded gold repatriation in the 1960s, America ultimately defaulted rather than honor its obligations. The London gold pool collapsed when coordinated manipulation could no longer suppress prices against market forces. I observe central bankers studying this history and drawing conclusions about the reliability of Western custodial arrangements. China's yuan internationalization strategy proceeds with characteristic patience. Offshore yuan clearing centers now operate in Hong Kong, Singapore, London, Frankfurt, and numerous other financial hubs. The inclusion of yuan in the IMF's special drawing rights basket in 2016 conferred official reserve currency status. I Analyze trade settlement in yuan expanding steadily, though the currency still represents a small fraction of global transactions. The limitations facing yuan adoption remain substantial. Capital controls restrict free convertibility, limiting the yuan's attractiveness for reserve holdings. China's financial markets lack the depth and transparency that characterize dollar markets. The legal and institutional infrastructure supporting dollar transactions has no yuan equivalent. I observe these obstacles as real but potentially temporary if Chinese authorities prioritize internationalization over domestic control. Saudi Arabia's willingness to consider yuan-denominated oil sales represents perhaps the most significant threat to dollar dominance. The petrodollar arrangement has anchored dollar demand for 50 years. If the world's largest oil exporter accepts alternative currencies, the artificial demand that sustains dollar supremacy begins evaporating. I analyze Saudi signals toward BRICS membership as indicating serious reconsideration of the kingdom's monetary alignment. The BRICS expansion announced at the 2023 Johannesburg summit signals a new phase in this financial realignment. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran joined the grouping, transforming BRICS from an emerging market forum into a bloc representing over 40% of global population and a substantial share of energy production. I observe this expansion as creating critical mass for serious alternatives to Western financial infrastructure. Proposals for a BRICS common currency have generated substantial discussion, though implementation remains distant. The technical challenges of monetary union among economies with divergent structures, inflation rates, and policy preferences are formidable. I analyze the more likely near-term development as a basket currency for trade settlement, reducing dollar usage without requiring full monetary integration. The new development bank, established in 2015 with $100 billion in authorized capital, provides an alternative to World Bank and IMF financing. I observe this institution financing infrastructure projects across member nations and beyond, with lending denominated in local currencies rather than dollars. The bank's governance structure gives emerging economies voice denied them in Western-dominated institutions. The network of bilateral investment treaties excluding Western participation continues expanding. I analyze China's Belt and Road Initiative as creating financial relationships and physical infrastructure that orient participating economies toward Chinese rather than Western economic integration. Over 140 countries have signed Belt and Road agreements, representing over $1 trillion in committed investments. The trajectory of dollar decline admits multiple scenarios. Gradual erosion might see the dollar's reserve share declining from current levels around 58% toward something approaching the 25–30% range over coming decades. This managed transition would allow adjustment without systemic crisis. I observe optimistic American analysts assuming this gradual scenario without considering alternatives. The sudden collapse scenario carries catastrophic implications. If confidence in dollar assets evaporated rapidly, the resulting financial crisis would dwarf 2008. American borrowing costs would spike as foreign demand for Treasury securities collapsed. The trade deficit that Americans have financed through reserve currency privilege would become unsustainable overnight. I analyze historical precedents suggesting that currency transitions often proceed gradually until they happen suddenly. The British pound's loss of reserve status provides the most relevant historical parallel. In 1914, sterling dominated international finance as completely as the dollar does today. Two world wars transformed Britain from the world's largest creditor to its largest debtor. Sterling's share of global reserves declined from over 50% in 1945 to under 5% by 1970. I observe this transition spanning decades but concentrated in crisis moments. The implications for American power extend far beyond economics. Military expenditure exceeding that of the next 10 nations combined depends on borrowing that reserve currency status enables. Sanctions effectiveness requires dollar centrality to international commerce. The ability to project power globally rests on financial foundations now under systematic assault. I analyze America as facing the prospect of strategic retrenchment that no political constituency is prepared to accept. I conclude my analysis with recognition that we are witnessing the early stages of a transformation whose ultimate dimensions remain unclear. The dollar will not disappear from international commerce, but its monopoly is ending. The parallel financial universe under construction by BRICS nations will coexist with Western systems, offering alternatives that limit American leverage and expand options for nations seeking independence from Washington's preferences. The world emerging from this transition will be genuinely multipolar in ways that the post-Cold War order never was. American policymakers who weaponize dollar dominance have accelerated the very outcome they sought to prevent. Future historians will mark this period as the moment when the financial foundations of American hegemony began their irreversible decline. The death of dollar dominance proceeds not through sudden collapse, but through the patient construction of alternatives that make American financial power increasingly irrelevant. Peace.